It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Nathan to you. Dr. Nathan received his bachelor's degree in social relations from Harvard University in 1957 and received his PhD in clinical psychology from Washington University in 1962. He spent 7 years on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry, where he launched a program of research on psychosocial factors in alcoholism, which he has continued to the present. Dr. Nathan moved to Rutgers University in 1969, where he was the director of clinical training in the psychology department and founded and directed the Alcohol Behavior Research Laboratory. He moved to the University of Iowa as Vice President for Academic Affairs in 1990, and in subsequent years became provost and then acting president in 1995. In 1996, he returned to a faculty position at the University of Iowa. He's currently a much prized member of the clinical area in the Department of Psychology at Iowa. He's served on a large number of prestigious panels and advisory boards. I could take the whole hour probably listing those. Instead, I'll just highlight one. Since the 1970s, Dr. Nathan has been very much involved in the development of the DSM criteria for mental disorders. He described to us earlier today how, as a psychologist in the 70s, the psychologist on the committee was definitely in the back of the bus, and as psychology has gained credibility over the years, I guess with the psychiatric community, he moved to the middle of the bus and eventually, I think, was very much in control of the bus or with others in the more recent work on DSM-4-TR, especially in developing the criteria for substance use disorders. Has he spent all of his time as an administrator and policy advisor? No. He's published approximately 200 journal articles and chapters, and edited or written a number of books, including a guide to treatments that work, which received the 1998 Psychology Award from the Association of American Publishers. In 1999, he received the American Psychological Association Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Knowledge. His work on substance abuse disorders encompasses basic processes that contribute to alcohol problems, also more practical problems of assessment and treatment, and the public policy implications of scientific findings. In my view, he really exemplifies the ideal of a scientist who uses his knowledge for the public good, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Peter Nathan.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I told colleagues in psychology that I've actually been coming to ISU for many years. I came here every 3 months when I was an administrator at the university to attend regents meetings, and that was something that I thoroughly didn't like, but had to do it. But I was always impressed by how good the food was in
Campus town.
yeah, and I'm sure that the students get the same quality of food that they serve the regents here. Anyway, I'm also glad to come here. I'm going to share with you a matter on which the University of Iowa is #1 in the state of Iowa. You may have the best football team, you may have the best men's basketball team, you may have the best women's basketball team, but in Iowa City, the students have the best of drinking establishments. And it may be hard for you to believe with Visha coming up, but no, the University of Iowa arguably may have the one of the highest rates of drinking by undergraduates of any university in the world. I'm going to talk about abusive drinking in American universities. I'm going to focus on the University of Iowa, but I'm going to try to generalize my talk beyond simply a single university. And I think it's also important to put this whole question of drinking in college in perspective. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not a new phenomenon outside the United States. It's not a new phenomenon within the United States. In fact, there are reports of alcohol-fueled food fights in the late 1600s at Harvard, when Harvard was a seminary to train ministers. And the food was so bad and the alcohol was so convenient that there were food fights, and quite a number of students were terminated from the university for throwing rotten food because they were intoxicated and felt they could do that. Moreover, the books written in the late 1800s about Stover at Yale. Stover was a football hero and really an all-American in every way. He treated women very well in a time when that wasn't necessarily the case. He respected his opponents on the football field. He was a conscientious student, and he was horrified at the amount of drinking that went on in New Haven in 1890, and he wrote, or the person who wrote for him, wrote about that a great deal. We all know about F. Scott Fitzgerald's Princeton and all the drinking that went on during that time, the Jazz Age. And that's probably how Fitzgerald himself acquired the alcoholism that ultimately killed him. So for virtually as long as we've had a national memory, we've regaled ourselves with stories about alcohol excess among privileged youth. Unhappily, abusive drinking is no longer confined to the undergraduates who go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton and other Ivy League schools. It is very much a feature of the undergraduate careers of virtually every student in every American college and university. Whether that student himself or herself abuses alcohol or simply knows people who do it. Despite the ubiquity of drinking, and especially abusive drinking in colleges and universities in this country, though, it wasn't really, it's surprising, it wasn't really until relatively recently, 50 years ago, that the first comprehensive study of drinking by American undergraduates was done. That was published in 1953, called American Drinking Practices. It was published by Strauss and Bacon out of the then Yale Center of Alcohol Studies. Their conclusion, after a survey of American college students, and it was a pretty limited survey, not anything like the surveys that have been done later on, but their survey nonetheless convinced them that drinking in college by college students was both more intense and more troublesome than anybody had expected or thought. And subsequent research on prevalence of drinking by college students, quantity and frequency of drinking, and quite a lot of it's been done, usually with limited samples, often focused on one or another university. On predictors of drinking, that is, the kinds of personality features, demographic features, personal identity features, and so on that are associated with abusive drinking, and on consequences of drinking, the things that happen to students after they've been drinking heavily. All of these have confirmed that there is a problem in American colleges and universities. And we know a lot more about that problem now than we did before. Most recently, in the early 1990s, a researcher from the Harvard School of Public Health named Wexler and his colleagues undertook a very large-scale study of drinking practices across the country. The objective of the study was to examine the extent of binge drinking by college students and the consequent health and behavior problems that binge drinkers create for themselves and for others on their campus. They define binge drinking in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense to Iowa undergraduates. Binge drinking was defined as 5 or more drinks on a single occasion by a male, or 4 or more drinks on a single occasion by a female. Now, in Iowa City, that's just the first 45 minutes of the evening. So when I present these data to students at Iowa, they don't think that's a binge. And in a sense, it doesn't matter what you call it. It's a standard against which you can compare some things. But Wexler called it a binge. And he also said there was a group of students also who were frequent binge drinkers. These were students who met the criterion for binge drinking: 5 or more drinks on a single occasion by a male, 4 or more drinks on a single occasion by a female, 3 or more times during a 2-week period, the 2-week period before his survey. So he then distinguished in his research between non-drinkers, very small group in most American colleges and universities, non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, and frequent binge drinkers. Wexler sent a survey, a self-administered survey, meaning that students filled this out themselves, to a nationally representative sample of U.S. 4-year college students. He surveyed students at 140 American colleges in 1993, including the University of Iowa and I think Iowa State. A total of 17,592 students returned these surveys. So this was a very large-scale survey, much larger than had ever been done before, both in terms of the numbers of students surveyed, the numbers of colleges and universities represented, the regions of the United States in which these colleges and universities were located, the kinds of colleges, private and public, religious and secular, very, very different kinds of places. His main outcome measures, the things he was asking about, included self-reports of drinking behavior, specifically on how many days during this 2-week period before the survey students actually consumed alcohol, and how much alcohol they consumed over that period of time. He also asked about alcohol-related health problems and other behavioral problems associated with the drinking. And I want to show you well, first let me say that what he found, among other things, was that 44% of the students in his sample met the criteria for binge drinking. That was a big surprise and a real worry for student service people and others who care about college students. That almost half of the students surveyed met these criteria for binge drinking was really more than anybody imagined. Now granted, as I said, 5 or more drinks on a single occasion by a male in Iowa is not heavy drinking by the standards of Iowans. But it's a fair amount of drinking. It, for one thing, would raise these young men to the legal intoxication limit or something slightly over that. That is, if they drank 5 drinks in an hour or 2, they'd be close to or beyond the 0.10 legal limit for driving. Similarly, 4 drinks for a woman, young woman, in an hour or two would also bring her blood alcohol level up to just about the legal limit, 0.10. So that was a worry, that was a surprise, and that was difficult for people to understand. Even more difficult was the fact that 19% of the students that Wexler surveyed met his criteria for frequent binge drinking, meeting the criterion for binge drinking 3 or more times during a 2-week period. 1 out of 5 students met this criterion. That was even more worrisome, because then it could be said, almost without question, that these students were drinking enough, perhaps, to interfere with a lot of important things college students have to do. And then Wexler gathered a lot of other data, and that's what I'm going to show you now, that really spoke directly to that issue. To what extent did drinking by these students who met these criteria, either for binge drinking or frequent binge drinking, to what extent did that drinking get in the way of their collegiate experience? These are Wexler's data. So what you see is, and first thing I want to point out is the big difference in consequences. This is a list of 11 consequences up to here that Wexler tapped, alcohol-related consequences. In our studies, we added 5 more, just to expand the range of questions. But what you see is that when he asked these 11 questions, that there was a big difference in the frequency with which non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, and frequent binge drinkers endorsed these consequences. So even something as benign as a hangover, 30% of the non-binge drinkers reported them, but 75% of the binge drinkers and 90% of the frequent binge drinkers reported having had a hangover. Now, that's a relatively benign consequence. Doing something you regret is a little less benign. And only 14% of the non-binge drinkers said they'd ever done something like that when they were drinking. But all the way up to 37% for binge drinkers, and basically 2 out of 3 of the frequent binge drinkers said that they'd done something they regretted after they'd been drinking. So meeting this criterion of binge drinking, and especially meeting the criterion of frequent binge drinking, has a real impact on one's behavior. So it doesn't matter whether Iowa students think that's a binge or not, it has an effect. If you then look at some of the other definitely more serious consequences, like engaging in unplanned sexual activity. Only 8% of non-binge drinkers reported that. 1 out of 5 binge drinkers reported it. And 2 out of 5, more than 2 out of 5, frequent binge drinkers reported that when they'd been drinking, or somebody else had been drinking, they got involved in unwanted sex. In fact, we're doing a research project now with some undergraduates at the University of Iowa. The belief is that a very substantial number of young women in their first year at the university get involved in unplanned or unwanted sexual activity because of their own drinking or their partner's drinking. A very, very serious problem, in part because often it's associated with unsafe sex. Again, you see the difference here between non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, and frequent binge drinkers. And you see some of the other consequences of, for example, frequent binge drinking. Only 2% of the non-binge drinkers said they damaged property when they were drinking, all the way up to 22% of frequent binge drinkers. So, the bottom line is Wexler established that people who met his criteria for binge drinking, and especially frequent binge drinking, got into an awful lot more trouble because of their drinking than did people who just drank and didn't meet the criteria for binge drinking. So that was very interesting. We then decided that maybe it would be an interesting kind of study to compare and contrast the national data with drinking at the University of Iowa. The reason we thought that was interesting was that Wexler set down some criteria based on his data that enabled him to predict which campuses were likely to have high rates of binge drinking. They were, first, campuses located in the northeast or the north central regions of the country. ISU and the University of Iowa both meet that criterion. Campuses residential campuses rather than commuter campuses. Your campus is residential, University of Iowa campus is residential. It's not a commuter campus. And third, campuses with one or more alcohol outlets within a mile of campus. Now, my understanding is there are one or more alcohol outlets within a mile of your campus. At the University of Iowa, there are 56 alcohol outlets within a mile of campus. Maybe the most in the world in a per capita, 56. Okay, but there's one additional reason why we wanted to do this research. There's a local option in Iowa City of which I know many of you are very jealous. That local option permits students who are under 21 to go into the bars and taverns of Iowa City so long as they don't drink. Okay? And they go in and they sit and they watch their 21 and older friends drink. They feel very envious. They listen to the music. And the question is, do they drink? Well, I'll show you some data about that. But there is this local option, and this local option has succeeded in increasing not only the number, but the profitability of bars and taverns in Iowa City enormously. And it's actually been currently looked at very seriously by the City Council, who've passed some ordinances designed to deal with the problem in part. So all of these reasons led us to feel that there might be some good reason to gather data on a quantity and frequency of drinking at the University of Iowa and its consequences. So let me start by showing you, let me pause and ask whether any of you have questions about why we did the study, the design of the study, or anything else. Any things I haven't made clear enough. Yes?
How accurate in general are self-reports for the students?
I'm sorry?
How accurate in general are self-reports?
No reason to believe they aren't accurate because they're anonymous. They did some checks. Others have done checks. If you ask people who have been diagnosed alcoholic who are pending some legal trouble as a result of their drinking or drug use, often those self-reports are not accurate. But I believe they're generally accurate. I think Wexler's data were accurate. I think ours are accurate too. There's nothing students could gain by being in. Good question, and it's an important question. Yes?
Does the amount of time that passes, like over the course of the night, differ or matter in the definition of a binge drinker? For example, someone who drinks 4 drinks in an hour, is that defined the same way as somebody who drinks 4 drinks in 4 hours?
Yes. And that's, he needed a definition that was easy to quantify. But as more studies are done, that's probably of some interest, in fact. In Iowa City, the bars have happy hours, and you can drink as much as you want during a circumscribed period, 6 to 8. Well, the assumption is that people get order an awful lot of drinks, drink them very quickly during that period of time, and then later on Other questions? Okay, we sampled 4 groups of University of Iowa undergraduates totaling almost 1,500 undergraduates over 4 years. We wanted to sample them in each of 4 years to determine whether there was a difference in quantity and frequency of drinking or consequences. And in fact, it turned out not to be a difference. Drinking at the University of Iowa is stable. That's the best thing you could say for it. It is quite stable. The mean of the age of students was just over 20 years. 69% of them were women, meaning about half of Wechsler's subjects were women, meaning that our data are skewed in the direction of women, and women drink less than men. So if anything, our data are really underestimates of drinking at the University of Iowa. All subjects were told before the study began that the data would be gathered anonymously. No student's drinking behavior could be individually identified, and yes, that was in fact how it worked out. So let's start and look at some of these data. The first thing, I think, well, let me orient you. The whole Iowa sample includes non-binge drinkers. We only sampled drinkers. Non-binge, there were a negligible number of non-drinkers at the University of Iowa. Non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, frequent binge drinkers, divided as Wechsler had done it. And here you see the 44% and the 19% of binge drinkers and frequent binge drinkers in the Wechsler national sample. And here you see the University of Iowa data. 70% of the students at the University of Iowa in this sample, and there's no particular reason to believe this isn't generalizable to the student body, met criteria for binge drinking. 7 out of 10. That's the highest figure Wechsler found. He said there were 1 or 2 schools where 70% of the students met criteria for binge drinking. Clearly, we were one of them. A dubious distinction. More important, perhaps, more worrisome, is the fact that almost 1 out of 2 students at the University of Iowa meet criteria for frequent binge drinking, 47%, as against 19% in the national sample. That is a much greater difference than between binge drinking in the national sample and in the Iowa sample. This, I think, is one of the most important and troublesome figures in the study. Yes?
So let me clarify. The 47% is 47% of the overall sample?
47% of the overall sample, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so what's the relation between the Iowa sample and the binge drinkers?
Well, here's the national sample, and here is the Iowa sample.
Yeah, what's the relation between the Iowa sample and are the binge drinkers included in the Iowa sample?
These, yes, all of these, when we gathered data, we had a variety of different studies going on. So that in some studies, we didn't divide subjects into non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, and frequent binge drinkers. In others, we did. But we did it in a consistent way so that I think we can generalize pretty well from the data that we gathered.
So those are 3 separate
Yeah, these are 3, well, the frequent binge drinkers are included in the Iowa sample, the binge drinkers are included in the Iowa sample, the frequent binge drinkers are included in the binge drinker sample.
And why you have 47% of the Iowa sample are frequent binge drinkers? Why?
Because, again, this number was derived from a circumscribed set of the frequent binge drinkers, gathered in a way that permitted us to make this judgment. Now look at the difference in number of drinking days. 3.15 for non-binge drinkers, 4.12 for binge drinkers, 5.26 for frequent binge drinkers. And look at the difference in number of drinks, 16.89, 23.6, and for the frequent binge drinkers, on average, 35.48. 35.48 drinks in 2 weeks approximates about 80 standard units a month. The usual distinction that's made between heavy social drinking and abusive drinking is 40 standard units a month. So that there are students who meet our criteria for frequent binge drinking who substantially exceed that number. A standard unit, by the way, is 1 12-ounce bottle of beer, 1 5-ounce glass of wine, 1 1.25-ounce glass of spirits, vodka, gin, bourbon, scotch, either in a mixed drink or straight. All right, so what appears to be the case is that there is substantially more abusive drinking at the University of Iowa than in the national sample. What are some of the correlates of this drinking? Well, if you look at gender, you see that there is a very substantial difference at our university between men and women. Men drink on more drinking days at the difference is significant at the .001 level. And they have significantly more drinks at the .001 level, and they are significantly more likely to meet criteria for binge drinking. Now this is interesting. You might say, this is a huge difference here, but this isn't such a big difference. 79.4% versus 92%. And the difference is accounted for by the fact that the binge drinking threshold is rather low, 5 drinks, 4 drinks. So it's not hard to meet that, and that's what accounts for this small difference. But the quantity and frequency of drinking difference is pretty substantial for males and females. And this is a difference that has been replicated time and again. The problem about drinking on American colleges and universities is, by and large, a male problem. Women drink more than they would if they were not in college. They get into trouble because of their drinking, but the problem, above all, is a male problem. Now, what about the 21-year-old question? Again, in Iowa City, if you're under 21, you can go into the bars and taverns of Iowa City so long as you don't drink. But if you look at these data, in fact, the kids who are under 21 go into the bars and taverns and they drink. In fact, they're more likely to meet the criteria for binge drinking than the kids who are over 21, although there's no significant difference in number of drinking days or the number of standard units consumed during this 14-day period. But what this says is that contrary to what the bar and tavern owners in Iowa City claim, when students go into those bars and taverns, they drink. They drink just about as much as the students who are 21 and older.
I just wanted to ask.
Loud.
Students that are under 21, in that survey, were all those students identified as students who were drinking in the bars, or was this just all University of Iowa students that do drink, or students that go as part of the
This is University of Iowa students.
just drink in general? If you didn't necessarily say in the survey, I do.
Well, I'm not sure what your question is.
The under 21 students that.
Yes,
that
they are students who are under 21 who go, and they can drink anywhere. This is just their reported drinking. Most of the drinking, now you may not know, students can't drink legally in residence halls at the University of Iowa, and they cannot drink legally in fraternities or sororities. So either they drink in bars and taverns or they drink at private parties. Our estimate is that most of the drinking, I mean, somebody's got to fill those 56 bars and taverns from Thursday night to Sunday night. And most of it takes place in bars and taverns, but certainly not all of it. Other questions? Yes?
I'm just curious if there's been research you looked at how accurate the self-report would be if they were intoxicated during the time they were recalling how much drink they were drinking.
How'd you say again?
I'm just curious, like, how accurate the self-report would be if they were intoxicated during the time, like, if they were trying to report the number of drinks they had during this time.
Good question. How accurate were the self-reports if they were intoxicated? Remember, all they have to, well, I was going to say, all they have to report for binge drinking is whether they drank 5 or more for the males, 4 or more for the females, but they have to do more than that. Our sense is that they have a pretty good idea of what they're consuming. Their friends tell them, they know how much money they have left after they come home of an evening. This is a retrospective self-report. Above all, our assumption was that the underreporters and the overreporters would probably be balancing each other out. But it's possible, I doubt there's a systematic error in one direction or another. That's what we assume.
I want to make a point that you'll probably agree with. When you say that drinking is primarily a man's problem, you mean that primarily men are the binge drinkers and meet the criteria for binge drinking in the study. I was wondering if you could speak to, in terms of drinking being a specific gender's problem, in terms of the severity of consequences
Absolutely.
for each gender.
It's both genders, because the drinking, the over-drinking that men do powerfully affects their partners, their friends, other men, and no question about that.
Statistics on that in terms of
Wexler actually did quite a lot of research on the consequences of drinking to people who actually didn't drink, and found that those consequences were pretty substantial. All you have to do, and I'm sure you've done it, some of you walk down the street in downtown Iowa City on a Saturday night and recognize that the consequences of the drinking that's done in Iowa City, they are not limited to the drinkers. It's not even drinking, and certainly not limited to the partners of the drinkers. Yes, that's a very good point. And when we talk about consequences that include damage to property, drunken driving, unwanted sex, unsafe sex, we're talking about consequences that affect more than the drinking. Okay, now, it's well known that people who have a family history of alcoholism are at greater risk to develop alcoholism themselves. And we looked at this phenomenon and asked ourselves whether people who said they had a family history of alcoholism were more likely to drink abusively. The answer is no. Now, on the one hand, that's reassuring in that it suggests that maybe this factor, family history, which influences the development of a risk for alcoholism, isn't influencing drinking behavior here, suggesting that maybe this isn't likely to lead to alcoholism. On the other hand, that it isn't related suggests that the peer issues, the peer pressures, the modeling that goes on that leads our students to this kind of drinking is so pervasive and so powerful that it transcends differences in family history. But the bottom line is family history doesn't affect this normative drinking. This is normative drinking. That is, this is the norm for students at the University of Iowa. So it isn't pathological drinking in the sense that alcoholism, which is influenced by family history, might well be. Now, there is a stereotype of people who belong to fraternities and sororities. that I suspect is not confined to the University of Iowa, to the effect that many of the people who join fraternities and sororities are looking to have a good time in college, to party, and to drink. And we wanted to determine the extent to which that, too, was an issue, a factor here. And in fact, we found that being a member of a fraternity or a sorority did influence significantly not only the number of drinking days, but the number of drinks in the previous 14 days, but it didn't influence binge drinking. So if you belonged to a fraternity or sorority, you were not more likely to be a binge drinker, but you were more likely to drink more, 30.14 standard units as against 21.98, and you drank about one more day during this 2-week period than the students who were not members of fraternities or sororities. So being a Greek did contribute in a fairly substantial way to this abusive drinking. Now let's get back to and look a little more carefully at the differences in quantity and frequency of alcohol consumption between males and females. I talked about it as being the consumption, the overconsumption as being a male problem. And if you divide subjects into non-binge drinkers and binge drinkers, and if you look here, about 1 in 12 males is a non-binge drinker. Not very many non-binge drinkers. But if you look at the difference between non-binge drinkers and binge drinkers, between females and males, non-binge drinkers look pretty much the same. Males who are non-binge drinkers drink about 3.56 drinks. Non-binge drinkers who are females drink about 3.5 drinks. So they're pretty comparable. And similarly, the number of drinking days, 1.8 versus 1.86, are pretty comparable. If you then, however, look at the binge drinkers, you see a very different story. And perhaps most telling of all is that binge drinking females drink 16.94 standard units in 2 weeks, and that's pretty substantial. But the males drink 36.29 drinks in 2 weeks. A very, very substantial amount of alcohol. So again, this simply makes more clear than the data I showed previously that we're talking about, in terms of overconsumption, abusive drinking per se, we're talking about a largely but not entirely male phenomenon. We're not, however, talking about a largely male phenomenon when we talk about the consequences of binge drinking and frequent binge drinking. And here we show the difference between self-reports of consequences, the University of Iowa sample and the national sample, non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, frequent binge drinkers in Iowa, national sample, binge drinkers, and frequent binge drinkers. The first thing I want to call your attention to is that if you look at these 22 numbers, which are the percentages of endorsement by students in the national sample of these consequences, and compare these 22 numbers with these 22 numbers, which is the percent of endorsement by University of Iowa students in binge and frequent binge drinking categories, you will see that in 22 of 22 cases, the University of Iowa students endorsed the consequences more highly. They experienced the consequences to a greater extent. That is really quite a troubling observation. Now, it's not surprising because we know that frequency of drinking, quantity and frequency of drinking, and consequences appear to be pretty directly related. So if students drink more, they're more likely to experience consequences. And in fact, that's the case at the University of Iowa. They drink more and they experience to a substantially greater effect range of consequences that we list here. Now, the second thing I'd like to call your attention to, again, is to the difference in endorsement between non-binge drinkers, binge drinkers, and frequent binge drinkers. In some cases, it's dramatic. In others, it isn't so dramatic. Arguing with friends, non-binge drinkers, 18.8%, binge drinkers, 44.2%, frequent binge drinkers, 61.6%. Engage in unplanned sexual activity. Again, a pretty substantial and serious consequence. Only 8.3% non-binge drinkers, 36.6% binge drinkers, 45.5%, almost half, frequent binge drinkers. Interesting here, this is a big difference. 2% gotten into a fight, 8%, 16%. Do something you regret, 12.5%, 65.6%, 73.7%. So these are very substantial differences. As we go along, if you have any questions, please ask them. Yes?
I just had time to skim the bottom. One of the interesting findings is suspended from school.
I'm sorry?
Suspended from school.
Yeah, now, suspended from school